From the iShin Broadcast Studio, it's the Under the Radar podcast.
Hey there, it's Jason Stahl with another episode of Under the Radar, and today we're going to talk about a very big, important topic, ADAS and liability, and I have two very special guests. I have Mike Reynolds, who is with Mobile Automotive Service Solutions. Welcome, Mike.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I'm very much looking forward to this discussion.
Sure, and we also have Rebekah Cooper from the Cooper firm. Welcome, Rebekah.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Sure, and so I want to start with you, Rebekah. A few weeks ago, I wrote a column in Body Shop Business on something I had seen on your website about crash avoidance systems as a litigation area, and it really kind of set alarm bells off to me, and I'd never seen that on somebody's law firm website before, and so I told our readers about it and kind of encapsulated what you had put on there. So my first question to you is, how did crash avoidance systems come on your radar as far as a potential litigation area?
Sure. So the way that, and you're not alone in that, unfortunately, it's not on a lot of people's radar from a litigation standpoint. They're focused obviously on doing the work in the body shop, but what we've seen is there is unfortunately a litigation component to it as well. The way that has looked for us is the first case was a case that came in the door. It was a Nissan vehicle that had been in a minor fender bender, went to a body shop. It was an OEM approved, authorized dealership, and the forward collision warning needed to be recalibrated as a result of the minor fender bender. So what we learned was the forward collision warning didn't work in a secondary crash, so several weeks later, and that crash was actually catastrophic and resulted in a young woman becoming a quadriplegic as a result. The litigation process or the discovery process, what we learned is that the calibration that Nissan said was required, and that was in, as you all know, I'm sure, in Nissan's literature as being required, the place where the vehicle was repaired they didn't have a single tool related to the calibration process. Their training manager did not know what the calibration process was. And that was the first time it came on our radar. Unfortunately, it was in a very tragic way, but what we realized was these vehicles are being updated with safety technology. That's a good thing to have, but they're not being maintained. That's not a fair statement across the board, but in that case, and then in subsequent cases we've seen that they're not being maintained. And that's how it got on our radar as a firm.
Interesting. And so, yeah, I was going to ask you that question next, if there were any real life cases, and you just told me about one. Are there any other cases that you heard out there of the other law firms are handling, or just in the news in general, of ADAS systems failing and resulting in injury or death?
Unfortunately, there are a lot of them. We were part of a network of lawyers who does work like this across the country, and we meet 2 or 3 times a year at conferences to talk through what kind of claims are out there. And these claims are on the rise because I think the statistic now is about half the vehicles on the road have ADAS technology in them, whether it's automatic emergency braking, forward collision warning, lane departure assistance. The group of attorneys that we are corroborating with to try to understand these claims and how to litigate them, I mean, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say there's at least dozens going on across the country at any given time.
Wow, that's interesting. That sort of flies in the face of, I did an interview 2 years ago on this podcast with a gentleman who's in the ADAS technology industry. And he claimed the liability was overstated. And the reason is because he said the numbers didn't bear it out. He said a lot of shops were missing a lot of calibrations, i.e. not doing calibrations because they either didn't know that it needed one, or they just flat out didn't do it. And there just wasn't the litigation cases out there going on to support this, and the numbers didn't bear it out. And it was alarming to me. Now, that was 2 years ago, not too long ago, but in 2 years, in today's day and age, when technology is moving so fast, 2 years is like like 2 days, right? So that was interesting. But here you're saying that this is indeed happening, that body shops are either not knowing that need to calibrate a car, or B, just flat out just not doing it even though they know it needs to be done, or they are not equipped to do it, or if they are doing it, and it's another thing we hear, there are shops doing calibrations, they're not doing them right. They're not following the OEM specs. So this is what you're saying.
Are the majority of these calibrations that just aren't getting done, or is it some that are getting done and done improperly as well?
It is a mix. The ones that are just not being done are pretty close, cases where it doesn't take long to figure out that even though they have the literature from the OEM somewhere on the shelf in the body shop, they just don't do it. It's just not ever become a part of their business practices. And frankly, in those cases, I end up feeling for the folks on the ground, the men and women trying to do their job in the body shop, because there's not nefariousness there. It's lack of training and lack of understanding. So there's those, and then there's the second category you mentioned, Mike, which is body shops trying to do the right thing, and for whatever reason not being equipped to do the right thing, whether that's and a lot of the times, we can just be honest, that comes down to financial pressures on what they can and cannot afford to do, maybe what they're trained to do. But I think unfortunately there's a mix of them not getting done at all, or if they're getting done, and you could speak more to this, it not being the right way, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. So tell me, and you guys can both chime in on this. Are these cases, is it where an auto body shop did the calibration or didn't do the calibration? They had their hands on it, or was it a subletter where the shop subletted the calibration to a calibration center, and the calibration center did not do a proper calibration, or was it a dealership? Do you know any of those specifics?
Well, I can say that our first case that I described was a dealership, and since then we've had less cases involving subletting out to a calibration company, for example. But I would be curious how many body shops are typically subletting that work out versus doing it in-house. I know that there are now a lot of calibration companies that's their specialty. But I don't know. Do you guys have a sense of how often that's getting farmed out versus how often they're trying to do it in house and keep the work there?
Yeah, I would say in our markets, it really depends. I would say maybe 30% are doing them in house, and the rest of them are usually using a sublet provider. But still today, I think there's a lot of calibrations that just simply aren't getting done. I think that's a big piece of it as well. So when you look at those numbers, you also got to figure that a large percentages actually aren't getting done altogether. So it's a big issue as well.
Yeah, I agree with you, Mike. I think the majority of shops are subletting them out, although I know the equipment manufacturers are coming out with advanced technology that makes it easier to be done in-house, and they're making a big push for that. So I think more and more body shops will be taking this on. What we always preach to the body shops is, whether you're subletting glass work, ADAS calibration, whatever you're subletting, some body shops feel that they are no longer liable because it's a subletter who's liable. But we always tell them, no, it comes back to you because you hired the subletter. Rebekah, maybe you can tell me who's liable in this case, and kind of correct body shop's perception that the liability is off their shoulders because someone else is doing the work.
Yeah, the short answer is typically going to be both. So in the legal world, it's called an agency theory. It's the same theory as if you go to if there's an injury caused by an employee of Home Depot, Home Depot as their employer is liable under an agency theory, meaning you take responsibility for what this person or sublet entity does. So I guess there are ways where you could attempt to get out of liability as the sublettor or the body shop delegating the work. It's not, it's not advisable without giving, attorney advice. I don't count on that. That's not likely to be compelling to a judge, and frankly, it's not likely to be compelling to a jury, because if you think about this, at the end of the day, this claim is going in front of 12 people who probably drive cars and are going to say, wait a second, if I take my car to Joe's body shop and Joe decides to use Smith, I don't want to have to, I don't want Joe to get out of, his responsibility to me because I went to him, right? So I think the short answer is that's not a good idea. There are ways you could try to, I guess, craft your way out of that liability via contract, but assume that if you are subletting out that work, you are ultimately responsible, which means that the folks you choose to do that work for you, the folks you choose to sublet out to, you've got to vet them. I mean, you've got to make sure that they are doing, crossing their T's and dotting their I's, doing what they need to do a repair properly. Pretend that they're a part of your shop.
And I can speak to that as well. And one of the things that we've seen a lot of is using terminology to, basically commit fraud. And I saw one just recently. The common one is to say, we did a calibration on this vehicle. Let's speak on Honda, for example. Honda wants you to do a radar aiming procedure, right? And there's a whole procedure it's laid out. That procedure may be static on a specific Honda, and you'll have a company come out, they'll get called out for a calibration, and they'll bill for a calibration, which could be whatever they decided it was. The most recent one I saw, that they did a dynamic calibration, which is a driving calibration on a vehicle that's not even equipped with that in the factory scan tool or in the service information. So when you look at that, and that's a big issue, because what's that company going to say? Well, they didn't ask us to do a radar aiming. They asked us to do the calibration, and this insurer pays this dollar amount for a calibration, so we drove it, and that's what we call a calibration. And in that term, and the challenging thing for us too, and all of our technicians are trained, is we don't see that vehicle when it's first in a collision. So when you talk about a Honda, if a Honda's hit within 300 millimeters of the front radar, it requires a calibration. Well, there's no way for any of our technicians, unless we see that vehicle when it first comes in the shop, we have no idea if it's hit there. So it's a lot of working with the collision shops directly, getting an understanding of what the vehicle needs, and then going about it that way. But from a liability perspective, that's one thing that we always talk with our clients about is look, if you don't give me the right information, I can't make the right decision on what that vehicle needs. So, we do our best to cover our clients with that, but ultimately I think that's important to know, is that, we have our own defensibility in that aspect, right? And we're going to do the best we can. But I agree, you also have to trust that the company that you're gonna bring out to do that work is vetted, and they know what they're doing, and they're going to protect you as best they can.
I think you're right, Mike. I think some shops have looked at this as a profit center. They know they're going to get extra pay from the insurance company for doing a scan or a calibration, but they don't really understand what they're doing. And they're not verifying that it was done correctly. But they know that, if I can do a pre-scan and I'll get this amount from the insurer, and then that'll be that. But, ignoring what the pre-scan told them and interpreting that and doing a diagnostic repair. So let's talk about the insurer and their liability. Now, even before ADAS, I've been in the industry for about 20 years. Whenever it came down to small claims court, the insurer's defense is always, we're not the expert. We're a third-party payer of claim. We just pay the claim. He's the expert. So when a repairer tries to say, well, the insurer made me do it, or the insurer wanted me to shortcut this repair, or the insurer said it doesn't need a calibration, and I listened to him, that doesn't hold water, because the repairer is the expert, the repair expert, and they put their hands on the vehicle. Rebekah, maybe you can interpret for me that stance, and if that holds water.
That's a rock and a hard place for the body shop, isn't it? Because if the pressure from the insurer is, don't do the work that we've decided is not necessary as the insurance company, but oh, by the way, if there's a lawsuit, we're not the expert. So we want to be the expert until that no longer behooves us, and now we have no say, right? And I know Mike and I have discussed this before, but that is a bad position for the body shop to be in. At the end of the day, and I frankly like y'all's thoughts on this, but everything that I've read and everything that we've done so far, at the end of the day, to me, the OEM literature and the OEM requirements for what needs to be done as far as ADAS calibration, would you guys consider that to be gold standard? I mean, if you could do everything that the OEM says to do every time you're working on a vehicle that needs a radar calibrated, would you consider that to be gold standard just as experts? Because I'm not a technical expert, so I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I definitely think so. And unfortunately, everybody wants to be an expert, but we didn't design the cars. I didn't engineer the systems. And especially when you're talking about ADAS systems, you're talking about components that sit on the front bumper that control acceleration and braking of the vehicle outside of the driver's control, right? This thing can accelerate and lock the brakes up without any driver input. So I don't think the gold standard is the right term. I think the only way to fix the car is by using the published documentation. And I want to add to that too. We look at a lot of manufacturers. I've got the service info up here for Volkswagen, and I'll see if I can quote it. It says the ACC calibration may only be performed using Volkswagen Audi approved alignment testers and adjusting devices. And on that specific front radar, there are two different plates that are used to adjust the front radar. And every dealership in the United States, to my knowledge, has to buy two of these plates, and then they go on an entire fixture. The total cost just for the radar equipment only to calibrate those front radars is, I think it's it's $12,000 for that equipment, right? And Volkswagen specifically says you need these two different tools. So if you have one radar, it uses this plate, and if you have a different style radar, it uses this one. So you get these aftermarket companies that come in and we say, well, our plate does not only all those Volkswagens with one, but it's going to do every brand. So, until somebody can come out and say, well, we engineered that system and we know better that our plate is better, I don't want to believe that, right? And the interesting part about that is, in order to do the calibration, you have to read the service procedure, and that's in the service procedure. You cannot do that procedure correctly without reading it, and you can't skip that part. So, when you look at that and then you look at the equipment, that's $12,000. And if you want to do all of the Volkswagen and Audi radar, or all of the Volkswagen and Audi ADAS equipment, you're looking at an investment of $47,000. And so for an insurer to say, well, this company is doing it incorrectly, but they're doing it with tools that are one size fits all universal tools, and that's what we deem the price should be. I think that's a big issue in our industry.
Yeah, going back to the OEM procedures, you may or may not be familiar, Rebekah, you probably are, of the John Eagle case. It's known as the John Eagle case in the collision industry, where a shop did not follow Honda's procedures in replacing a roof of a vehicle, and it subsequently got in a very bad collision where the occupants were severely injured, and I think it was a $30, $40, $50 million judgment because they didn't follow the procedures. They didn't have access to the procedures, and they didn't know to follow the procedures. And unfortunately, I think, there's a lot of shops that still are not following OEM procedures by rote, and especially in calibration, and we emphasize that all the time, you have to follow the procedures to the letter. There's no variation. It has to be done the way they say it. It's a lot of it's time, a lot of it's access. There's it could be 100 pages of these procedures to follow, to read. So it's a little bit more complicated, but can you afford not to do that, right? Because of the liability. I wanted to talk about, Mike, something that you brought up too. We have these new estimate scrubbing systems. The gentleman I talked about earlier, who said the liability was overstated a couple of years ago, he invented ADAS Think, and it's a scrubbing system that goes over an estimate and can tell you. You put the VIN of the vehicle in, and it tells you what kind of calibration, if the car needs a calibration, and what kind of calibration, and all this information. But I think, Mike, you made a point of this is not always accurate information, and so the body shop has to double check this information with the OEM repair procedures, cross check it. So is there liability there when the system you're using, that you're forced to use by name the insurance company, is not giving you accurate information?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at, well, and I'll say this, we own a software company that does something very similar. It pulls estimates from CCC and scrubs them, and I'm very familiar with the process. And it's only as good as the input we get. So if you look at a lot of those and some of the big common ones, there's one of them I just read, you're required to have your own insurance policy and indemnify that scrubber in case they give you incorrect information. But the fact is without being there to actually physically look at the vehicle, there's a lot you can't necessarily tell. And so, we talked about the Honda being within 300 millimeters of the impact being within 300 millimeters of the radar. Well, you can't tell that from an estimate. So there's a lot of, I think these scrubbers have a really important impact in the market. I think we're starting to catch calibrations that wouldn't have been done otherwise. But unfortunately, I don't think it's something that shops should be leaning on to say, well, this software didn't say didn't qualify a calibration, so this needs nothing. And that's the scary part of it, is when we start looking at that software as the end all be all for replacement for reading the procedures and researching.
Given what you just said, Mike, about the Audi and the Volkswagen, where these procedures are laid out and you literally cannot do the work without reading a procedure that says, use this device, use this technology, use this tool to do this accurately. And I love that you said it's not the golden standard, it's the only standard. So even if a body shop or repair company comes in and says, this tool was cheaper and it's supposed to be one size fits all, if there's a document from the OEM saying what to use to repair that vehicle, and that is not what the body shop used, whatever the reasons are, that's a problem. And it's a problem that folks are going to argue the body shop, regardless of extenuating circumstances, needs to fix. Because again, if I'm just bringing my car in as a layperson, I don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but I expect that the body shop is going to do what they need to do so that I can drive my car safely out of their facility. So that the aftermarket stuff, I'm less familiar on the technical side of it, but I do hear this refrain over and over that it is not a replacement for the OEM stuff, and the push to replace OEM stuff with aftermarket stuff is dangerous.
And I think aftermarket tools are great, but we work with all the OEM tools. We took that stance, right away. We wanted to have the correct tools to do the jobs, and I've been able to see with my own eyes where the aftermarket tools just in some instances aren't doing it correctly. And unfortunately, I think the issue is most of these people using these aftermarket tools have no idea. They didn't bother to read the service information. They have no idea that there's actually two tools, and that even the Volkswagen makes their dealerships buy both of them because they're not the same. So I think it's a big education issue, and I think there's a lot of misinformation out there.
Presented from the Aishin Broadcast Studio at Babcock's Media.
So shops getting reimbursed fairly for these procedures. This has been an ongoing problem in the collision industry where insurers are underpaying for repairs needed or just denying payment. And a lot of shops today have kind of modeled themselves after the medical industry. They're going after the consumer for costs that their insurer won't cover. So maybe this is a question for you, Rebekah. If an insurer refuses to pay for something or pays less than what is needed to do a proper and safe repair, does the insurer hold any liability? Or again, does it fall on the shop for allowing that to happen?
The easy target is going to be the shop. That's just the reality of it. And I appreciate your comparison to the healthcare industry, because the big picture, the big problem is the way that the insurance company is able to control treatment, just like it's a problem if the insurance company is able to control repairs. So it's not a one size fits all. This is when the insurance company is liable. This is when the body shop's liable. But I will say, if someone drives off of a body shop lot with an improperly repaired or inadequately repaired ADAS system, the first person they're going to look at is not their insurance company. It's likely going to be the body shop or the calibration company. Now, this is where I go back to the rock and a hard place. I think that what I would want as a body shop is to communicate as clearly and effectively as I can to both the customer and the insurance company that this is our commitment. These are the tools that we need to use to do this properly. And if we cannot do this, your vehicle is not going to be safe, or your insured's vehicle is not going to be safe. We can't guarantee the quality of the repair. Now, I don't know, from a business standpoint, that's not necessarily feasible, right? Are you turning those customers away then? Are you saying, look, we can't repair a vehicle because we're not able to do the standard that we think is appropriate? I think that's a question that's out there right now for the body shops, which is how do you respond when you are going to be the first line of defense for making sure something's safe when you repair a vehicle. And I don't say that I think if you're doing a good job, then that's great. But I also think there's a nuanced dynamic there now, because insurance companies are starting to have input similar to the healthcare system. They're a for-profit business. So they're not a nonprofit making sure that, benevolent, making sure that all the repairs are proper. They're a for-profit business. I mean, and they want to pay as little as possible for these repairs. And they're not as concerned as they should be about doing them the right way. I don't think that's an out there statement. I think there's evidence of that everywhere.
Yeah, Mike, I think that Rebekah brought up something that you had brought up to me before we got on this podcast was, what if a vehicle owner acknowledges that the calibration wasn't completed and signs a waiver? Does that free up any liability on the shop's behalf? Because I think your point was that, okay, the vehicle owner signed that this was okay, but then they go out and get in an accident and injure other people on the road who did not sign any sort of waiver.
Yeah, I think about that often. Some of the things that we see going down the road, I don't want my family member driving on the same roads as that vehicle. So I think that's a big concern.
Yeah, and so Rebekah, how messy can these cases get? Because you mentioned the woman that was made a paraplegic, but did she injure other people, or did she hit other people with her car that injured? And this could be one much bigger than just one occupant in one vehicle, right?
Right. In that particular case, she was the only one injured because the vehicle she was in struck a logging truck, and the driver, it was a large logging truck, and the driver of the logging truck was walked away from the crash just fine because he was up in the cab. But we do have cases like that where there are other people on the road who were not a part of the decision to calibrate a radar. They weren't part of the repair process. They're just driving on the road, and there's an 18-wheeler behind them that may or may not have properly calibrated forward collision warning radar, or may or may not have a properly calibrated, just has nothing to do with them except for they are forced to be on the road with these vehicles because we're a driving society. That's how it is. So we have cases like that, and it's devastating because it typically results in a catastrophic injury that I can tell you the people in the body shop who were doing what they did weren't thinking about that consequence down the road. They're honestly probably trying to do their best job at a job every day, but I think a lot of what that goes back to is training. I mean, were they trained? Were they given the opportunity to do what they were supposed to do? And I think that's a leadership question. That's who's taking responsibility at those shops. It's incumbent upon the owners to require that those folks are doing what they need to do. If a guy has been working in a body shop business for the last 20 years and never learned to calibrate a radar, it's the responsibility of the person who hires him to teach him how to calibrate a radar, or to farm it out to someone who's a professional.
We talk about building a bulletproof file that we always tell shops to document. And a lot of these scan tools and calibration equipment today allows you to print out what you did and attach it to the file and the estimate to show the consumer that what was done. Mike, if a shop comes to you for a calibration, do you provide them bulletproof documentation that they can use and staple to the estimate and give to the consumer to say this was what was done and it was done correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a big part of what we do. And somebody mentioned transparency earlier, and that's a big piece of it too, is working with the shop to understand what needs done, why it needs done. When we started, it was difficult. We had to explain that, here's what this radar does. Here's, especially when we started, we've been in this for a little while, and most of the folks in the shop might not have even known what that radar was, or not known that the occupancy sensor needed a calibration. So a lot of transparency there. We have access to all the OEM service information, so we can go and, print that documentation for them, and then also print documentation from the OEM scan tools. Each OEM scan tool is a little bit different. A lot of them are Windows based, but we have a setup where, everything goes into a file, and then they get access to all of that. So we can prove and timestamp and show that, yes, this was done correctly, which I think is a very important thing. You also have to keep in mind that if we do a calibration, some of these radars sit on the front bumper. So it's imperative that we document that, because let's say a shopping cart rolling through the Walmart parking lot bumps that radar a week later and shifts it. We need to be able to prove and document that at the time, this vehicle left our care, it was calibrated correctly, and here's our screenshot, here's our values from the radar, and here's our documentation. So that's very important.
Yeah, let me go back to you, Rebekah, too. And I should have asked this earlier. More specifically, this case you're talking about with the woman who was severely injured, was this a failure? You mentioned forward collision warning. Was this a failure with the automatic emergency braking? And it made me think, like, are most of these cases related to that automatic emergency braking, or is it blind spot monitoring, or is it lane departure? Is there a trend there?
Yeah, the primary technology that we're seeing in these cases, forward collision warning and automatic emergency braking. So typically the way it works is the radar senses the object upcoming and it warns first, and then it gives the driver some time to react, and then if it senses that the driver is not reacting, it brakes. That's the one we see the most of, but lane departure warning, occupant sensors are another. I mean, the vehicle safety devices are going to work differently if there's an occupant in the passenger seat, for example. So all those sensing devices, and it's only going to continue, right? We're not at the final iteration of technology in cars today. We're at one of the earliest, right? We've got the self-driving cars that are being rolled out in Austin and Atlanta right now. Cars are just going to become computers with radars all over them, or LiDAR, whatever it ends up being. So right now it's primarily forward collision warning and automatic emergency braking, but the same applies to, backup cameras. I think backup cameras are a good example. They've been around for so long. Folks don't turn around like that, and look behind them when they're driving now. They look at their backup camera. So there's the longer these technologies are around, the more drivers are going to rely on them, and I think it makes it that much more important that they actually work. At the end of the day, you can say it's the driver's responsibility, and it is, but the reality is they're going to rely more and more on the radar sensors the more that they're able to help them.
And I want to chime in on that. I think when we first got into this, I heard that all the time. It's the driver's responsibility. It's the driver's responsibility. And I'll never forget the first time I saw this, but you take a radar that is hit in a collision and it's pointing upwards, and you put that car back into service, and that car drives around, no lights, no warnings, anything. And then one day they're doing 60 miles an hour under a low overpass, and the brakes lock up because it sees that bridge that it's about to go under, and it thinks you're about to hit it, and it's going to lock the brakes up. So you can't say that it's up to the driver to maintain. The driver had no input. The driver didn't hit the brakes. The vehicle did that. So that's the really important thing that I think, we really as an industry need to wrap our head around, is that we're not, this isn't just a sideshow. This is controlling the vehicle.
Yeah, and you made a good point earlier, Rebekah, that ADAS vehicles have been around long enough now where people are relying on these systems. I bought an ADAS car 2 years ago, and I wasn't comfortable looking at the rear view camera when I was backing up. I was still looking behind me. I didn't trust the camera. Now I totally trust the camera. Now all I do is look at it because it doesn't lie. My eyes can lie. My neck might hurt that day and I can't move. The camera doesn't lie. So I have, over the course of 2 years, have more and more relied on these features. I turned off lane departure warning when I bought the car because it was driving me crazy. And I put it back on because I just felt right, and it's kind of like a safety blanket. I don't think it makes me any more safe on the road, honestly, but it makes me feel that way. So that's interesting. I think more and more the reliance on these systems, and they're safety systems. We're not talking about a plastic bumper, although that there's debatable about that, but these are all very directly related to safety and with the intent of avoiding a collision. So it's very important to make sure they're repaired properly. And this industry has always had liability, right? I mean, it's just obvious. The John Eagle case had to do with welding, not ADAS. So there's tremendous liability, and it just keeps growing. So Mike, there's been some rumblings in the industry about State Farm forcing a shop to, if you're on State Farm's preferred program, forcing a shop to use a particular subletter for the calibration, or at least match their price. What is a shop's options there? Do they have to do this? I mean, I guess if they're under contract, they probably do. But what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, there's a few different options. In some instances, that pricing is reasonable, but in a lot of instances, they're not. The manufacturer says explicitly we need to use this tool, like we talked about, Volkswagen and Nissan and a few other manufacturers. You simply just can't do it correctly under the pricing that they've allotted. So, in some instances, we've seen shops that are starting to talk directly to the customers and say, look, this is what your insurance is willing to pay. This is the way that we want to do it, and this is why. And again, that's all about being transparent, providing that documentation, and getting it in front of the insurer and letting the insurer make that denial. And I don't know from a legal standpoint what happens if the insurer denies, doing it with the appropriate tools or doing it, correctly. I'm not quite sure what that would look like from a legal point of view. But that's some things that we've seen shops do. It's a challenging thing, and I think it's all about transparency and being as upfront. And they got to put up a fight, unfortunately.
Yeah, I don't want to speak for Rebekah, but I've always heard that these DRP contracts, these direct repair program that body shops sign and get into a preferred network. If the shop had an attorney review it, they would tell them to run as fast as they could the other way, because it's really all about shielding the insurer from liability. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Rebekah.
Well, yeah, I think if you're going back to what we said at the beginning of this discussion, if you are insulating the insurer from liability because the body shop and the calibration company is the expert, then the insurance company should let the body shop and the calibration company be the expert and decide what the right thing is to do to repair these vehicles. Now, as Mike is saying, that's easy for me to say sitting here, but that's not what happens in practice. In practice, there's pressure to either not do the calibrations or to do the calibrations using tools or in a way that's cheaper and sometimes not proper, not correct. I would like to have a better solution at this point. I would say that the documenting is critical. I think you put the pressure on the insurance, both as the body shop and the insured, right? I think the insured, the first thing is the insured should know what's going on. The insured should be able to make a decision about, do they even want to drive that car off the lot? In that case, do they want to get their vehicles serviced at your location if you have that relationship with the insurance company that requires a certain kind of work? Now, again, that's easy for me to say. That affects the bottom line for people who make a living, running body shops and calibration companies. But I think from protecting, a standpoint of protecting yourself and frankly protecting the customer, documenting is the way to go. I mean, you let them know this is what's going on. This is what we recommend. This is what the insurance company is saying you can have. Here's a letter that we want to send to the insurance company. I've had discussions with a couple of folks from body shops about preparing just a form letter for a Volvo, a Nissan, a Honda, and say, copy and paste the OEM requirements into the letter and say, this is what's required by Honda. You, insert insurance company, are telling us we can't do that. This is a safety issue. We are concerned about our customers' safety. You should be concerned about your insured safety. Now, State Farm might ball that up and throw it in the trash, but if they're getting those letters consistently from body shops across the country, it's not going to be letters they want in their file. It's not going to be it's not going to be letters that they want, because they want at the end of this whole thing to be able to say, as we've discussed, we're not the experts. What do you want us to do? And so documents say, but you inserted yourself in the repair process, right?
I love that idea. Like, I would love to see a template like that we could hand out that, kind of covers that loosely, because I think transparency is huge.
And you could have templates for both the customer and the insured, and you can have templates for what the customer sends to their insurance company. I mean, we could talk through those, but those are options to apply pressure for sure.
Yeah. Well, I really want to thank you guys for being on the podcast today. The collision industry has always had a lot of liability, obviously, for obvious reasons. The John Eagle case we referred to earlier involved welding, not ADAS at all. But the ADAS component has increased the liability exponentially. So I really appreciate your time. We now know there are real life cases out there that are really happening. Calibration, ADAS system failures, calibrations that are not being done or being done incorrectly. This is a developing trend and probably a trend that's going to grow. So I really appreciate you guys being on the podcast today and giving us your 2 cents on this situation. Rebekah, Mike, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you both. It's been a pleasure.
I'm Jason Stahl. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching this episode of Under the Radar. For more episodes, visit bodyshopbusiness.com.